This episode of Artist Decoded is brought to you by No Wave Academy. As creatives and artists, we have each personally experienced the turbulent road of artistic self-improvement. And as the co-founder of the LA-based artist collective No Wave and No Wave Academy, I can tell you that our objective is to offer an alternative path to a traditional arts education. No Wave Academy courses are taught by some of our favorite artists. They're also our personal heroes and colleagues. Some of these artists you may have heard on this very podcast, while others have been featured in exhibitions at the No Wave Gallery. Such artists include Casey Baugh, Mia Bergeron, Nick Runge, Sean Cheatham, and Kate Zambrano, to name a few. All of our instructors are working professional artists that have been showcased in galleries and museums, both locally and around the world. At No Wave Academy, we work tirelessly towards evolving the way you learn and to expand your artistic passion and craft from the very best in the field. We believe that everyone has a unique artistic spirit. With guidance, experience, and the proper tools, students have the ability to invigorate and elevate their work. You can unlock and unblock your creative inner voice. Join us and walk into the next chapter of your personal artistic evolution. Go to nowaveacademy.com. That's nohwaveacademy.com. Type in AD-10 at checkout for 10% off. Now, on to the episode. Hey everyone, how's it going? This is your host Yoshino. You're listening to episode 184 of Artist Decoded. And our guest today is Professor of Cognitive Psychology and Neuroscience at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, Jeffery Martin Zacks. And he is an MA and PhD in cognitive psychology and graduated from Stanford University. He has 3 books out entitled Flicker, Event Cognition, and 10 lectures on the representation of events in language, perception, memory, and action control. And I'm here on the phone with director and filmmaker Columbia Tatone, who did the interview. So how are you doing? How's your day?
Good. How are you?
Good. I'm good. We're doing it. We're doing this intro right now.
Here we are.
Here we are. Here we are. So how did you find out about Jeffery and his work?
Yeah. So I am a big nerd of the brain and neuroscience and psychology, and specifically how how cinema impacts us neurologically and vice versa. So I was Googling one day, just out of curiosity, some of those things. And I came across Jeffery and his book Flicker, which is about our brain on films. And he gets pretty granular in there, which is really interesting. And so matched with that. And then, of course, I'm sure most of you, if you haven't, go and see A Social Dilemma on Netflix. After seeing that and reading Jeffrey's book, I thought he would be such a great person to have on the podcast and kind of pick his brain on a thing or two.
Definitely.
So we get into it. It's good. I think you guys are going to enjoy it.
Definitely. Yeah. This is a great, very informative interview, and you did a really good job. And I especially like what you two were talking about mirror neurons. And it's something that I've been thinking about, but haven't really been able to contextualize in a scientific realm or sense. So yeah, that was really interesting for me.
Awesome. Yeah, it's good. I'm excited for everyone to hear it.
All right. Well, before we begin this episode, we recently launched a YouTube and Patreon page. The YouTube has tons of clips and full episodes, so check us out there and be sure to subscribe. Our Patreon is at www.patreon.com/artistdecoded. Support us over there or go to our iTunes page and leave us a review. So here it is, without further ado, AD 184 with Jeffery Martin Zacks. Hope you enjoy it.
Jeffery Zacks. Super excited to have you here with us today. And why don't you give us a little bit of a background on what you do, what your specialty is?
Sure. So I'm a human cognitive neuroscientist, which means that I'm interested in how people think and behave and perceive and remember and how the brain gets those things done. And in the context of that, in my lab, we spend a lot of our time working on so-called serious problems like how cognition changes with aging and Alzheimer's disease and how we can intervene to improve memory and how the brain changes in response to neurological disorders. But we do a lot of that work using films. And I early in the game realized that when you show people films, it produces these tremendous responses in the brain. And I got really interested in what was going on with the film per se. And so this has been an ongoing interest of mine for a couple decades now. And it eventually led me to hook up with filmmakers and artists and to write this book called Flicker Your Brain on Movies. And it's continued to be something that's been of great interest in the lab over the last few years.
Amazing. Yeah, that's how I came across you. I, as a filmmaker, I mostly do commercial, very big fan and nerd of the brain. And, I've always been very curious about how much impact does a film really have in changing or shaping us as people and vice versa. And so, I was just kind of Googling away one day these questions on, what does that look like and how can I make my films or my actors or the lighting or how do all of these things that we use in the process of filmmaking, how can I accentuate it to really change or give a message or send a message? Or get someone to, especially in commercial, it's like we're selling a product, what is it about? Is it really the comedy factor? Is it the lighting? And is it the actor's delivery? Like what is this thing? And so, there's the psychology of it and then the neuroscience aspect and, how our brains are reacting to these things. And so I was Googling away and I came across your work and Flicker and immediately had to get the book. Everyone out there, you must get this book. It's called Flicker, Your Brain on Movies. And I really appreciated reading it. Yes, I'm a filmmaker, but I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a neuroscientist. And I was still able to, digest all of it and take it in. It's very, what felt like dense reading. I had to stop and think, and reflect on a lot of things. But I was just so excited to have you come on the show and kind of dive in a little bit deeper and share this side of filmmaking and learn what we can from you on, how can we make it better? How can we change? So it's nice to have you.
Well, thanks. And let me jump in. You said, one of the things you said was, I'm not a psychologist, but I find this to be true of like all the filmmakers I really like. You guys are amazing psychologists. In your work in particular, I'm struck by like how incredibly vocally you can present a character. Like these people just jump off the screen in short films, whether it's commercial work or your video work. Like there's a strong sense of personality that comes out within like 10, 15 seconds. And how you convey that from these really thin slices of behavior is something that psychologists need to understand.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And I agree. It's like especially with commercial, like the short, the 15 second, the 30 second to be able to convey something. And I know that's something you kind of touch on in your book in terms of like the edit and how our brains are able to fill in certain things, things that matter, or even when things are missing and how we're able to put together these splices or these cuts or these edits and our brain sort of magically fills in the rest. But I mean, we can get to that later, but I wanted to, I was really fascinated by the science behind mirror neurons and how, you're the expert, so I'll let you explain because I'm going to completely destroy it. But I think it's really important. And I would love to hear you kind of expand on what mirror neurons are and how they play a part in filmmaking.
Yeah, sure. So let me start by talking about like a more general phenomenon that's really important for understanding human perception and human behavior and film perception in particular. So we talk about mirror neurons, but let's start with what I'll call mirroring, which is this more general phenomenon of when I see something or hear something or read about something, it evokes corresponding representations in the action systems of my brain. So we can see this all the time in everyday human behavior. So the audience won't be able to see this, but you and I are looking at each other across the screen. And when you smile, I tend to smile. And this is a really powerful phenomenon. If one person yawns, the other people in the room tend to yawn contagiously. You can get a whole room full of people yawning. And in the lab, you can play these little games where if the experimenter starts kind of subtly tugging on their ear and itching their ear, pretty soon the other person in the room is likely to be doing those same behaviors. We match our rates of speech. We match other features of how we talk. So we mimic each other all the time. And this is helpful for coordinating socially and for promoting social affiliation. And one reason it's helpful is if we're going to shake hands or if we're going to work together on fixing a car or something, for me to have representations of what's going on in your motor system get activated in mine, that can help me do my planning and perception. So this is a really powerful effect, and it happens in huge ways when we're doing film perception, in part because like the images are really big and the filmmaker can focus in on the part that they want to evoke in our brain. One mechanism for implementing in the brain that kind of mirroring are these really cool cells that were originally discovered in the frontal lobes of the macaque monkey called mirror neurons. And Giacomo Rizzolatti and his colleagues found these cells that have these really interesting properties. So one thing is that they respond to really specific goal-directed actions on objects. So if a monkey reaches out for a peanut by picking it up by pinching it, there might be some cells that respond basically just to that kind of action and very little else. Like if the monkey reaches for the same peanut, but it grabs it with its whole hand instead of pinching it, then the cell wouldn't respond. And then the second cool property that they have is that they respond not just when the monkey does the action, but also when the monkey sees another monkey or an experimenter do that same action. And it shows the same sensitivity in performance and in perception. And you can see how that computational mechanism would be one powerful way to do part of implementing this phenomenon of mirroring. But it turns out there's lots of other instances of mirroring and mimicry that probably don't depend on mirror neurons. And knowing that some of it depends on this one particular piece of kit in the brain is kind of like discovering the carburetor and saying, oh, I figured out how cars work. It's one piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't tell you that much about what makes us human. But on the other hand, it's such a powerful physiological phenomenon that it tempted people to say, oh, well, this explains like mimicry and emotion and empathy and what goes wrong in all kinds of emotional disorders. And I think that most of those claims were just a bridge too far, and they haven't panned out so great.
Interesting. Yeah. So, when we watch a film and it's a tearjerker or something's happening to the character that you're sitting there, you're just as upset as they are, or you're upset for them. And I'm always curious, if I'm experiencing this moment with the character or for the character, and I'm even, physically crying myself, is my brain filing that as a memory and an experience that I'm having as if I had literally lived through it?
Yeah, so there's this, this phrase that comes from Wordsworth, the willing suspension of disbelief, which we're thought to need to appreciate fiction. And some of my colleagues in psychology have said that's actually totally backwards, that really what we should be talking about is willing suspension of belief. So that, the way the brain approaches the world is walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And most of what we've encountered in our lives is real. In terms of the evolutionary history of the human species, fiction is pretty young and movies are like, just born. And so it takes some extra cognitive control to segregate off these stimuli that look like real life but aren't, and mark them as something different. And one consequence of that is that you see all kinds of confusions in people's memory. Like, people actually have a pretty tough time keeping straight things that really happened to them from things that they saw in a movie.
Right. And I think that's amazing. Like that's wild, but it's great. It's great news for me, as a director. When I began directing, everyone would say, "Oh, you're a storyteller. That's really great." But I never really felt connected to the idea of being a storyteller as much as I have the idea of being a messenger. I like to look at film as an additional healing modality, and how it can shape or change and be this non-invasive way to talk about things, bring people from segregated ideologies or belief systems or ways of life or doing life, and kind of put them under the same roof and saying, we'll look at this situation. And because film uses so many of our senses to convey a message, I just feel like it's pinging off of so many areas of our brain. And if we're able to embody that as some sort of experience, I think that it can be really powerful. And so you had mentioned in your book several studies about how there were some children, young men that they had followed throughout life. They, at the younger age, they were watching more aggressive TV shows and films. And then 20, 30 years later, sort of taking a look back at, well, how did this affect them? And I thought that was pretty interesting to learn that, yes, those studies did kind of show that it does have some effect on later in life.
Yeah, those studies are fascinating. You take boys and you look at their viewing habits when they're in grade school, and you also look at a bunch of factors that might be associated with later aggression, like, do their peers find them to be aggressive? Do their teachers rate them as aggressive? And then you look at how they behave in high school and what happens to them after they graduate high school. And after you control for all the other stuff that you can manage to control for, you find these associations between what they watched when they were little and how much they watched, and what kinds of aggressive behavior and what kinds of consequences of aggression they experience as adults. Studies like that have inherent limitations, and that's just one source of evidence. But there's evidence coming from lots of different directions that all converges on this conclusion that spending a lot of time consuming aggressive media as a young person is associated with behaving more aggressively down the road.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, there's been obviously a lot of controversy about why are these kids coming into schools with guns, or, they're blaming it on the video games and all this stuff. And I mean, to me, it seems like it would make sense that, kids sitting in their bedroom for 4 hours a day with some shooter gun, type of aggressive video game, that has to be shaping them in some form, and how they later relate on one-on-one is got to be, there must be something there. I'm not saying that it's the reason why a kid would go into, further that, but maybe that they're somehow desensitized to it. I know in your book you also mentioned that there is the factor of, it's not necessarily always that the watching these aggressive television shows or whatnot is making them aggressive, but perhaps their environment in which they already live in is aggressive, or there's some other, things going on there that leads them to that, or finds a home in that, or finds further expression in that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that you said about, well, that's not going to be the thing that causes them to behave in a certain way is key. There's most of the causes that we encounter in our environment are probabilistic. There's not a thing. What they do is, just tilt the odds a bit. And if you look at the magnitude of the effect of consuming lots of aggressive media on the likelihood of getting into trouble with aggression, it's not an all or none thing any more than driving fast means that you're going to get in a car accident on this drive, or visiting a dangerous neighborhood means that you're going to be subject to violence. I mean, all of these things they're probabilistic, and there are lots of things that contribute to them.
Sure.
But the evidence that this is one of those things that contributes is now pretty solid.
It's pretty solid. Has it changed what you let your kids watch or play? Or is there a limit?
Right. So that presumes that I get some say in the matter. It's made me, first of all, more conscious of the attitude that I bring to watching violence. You take a lot of my favorite filmmakers, Kubrick, Tarantino. There's a lot of great filmmakers have used violence consistently and inventively. And, this research makes me kind of think about my mindset when I'm engaging with that kind of media, and encourages me to be critical. And it also totally, affected my thinking about like what my kids should be exposed to when.
Yeah. And do you think that when you say when, is there like a marker like, all right, you're 17 now, your brain's at this type of development, you can kind of understand, at this point? Do you,
Yeah.
because these things like, well, I know the developmental stage of your brain at age, whatever, you can handle this kind of content and be able to separate what's real and what's not, or?
Yeah. So people have actually done studies looking at like, does it matter whether the violence is justified or unjustified, whether it's realistic or non-realistic? And it would be great if there were really strong moderating effects of this. So you could say, what's really bad is random, unmotivated violence, but looking critically at justified violence is fine, or cartoon violence is fine, but realistic violence is not fine. Part of it's that it just takes a lot of data to get a clear picture, and we don't have enough. But so far, there aren't like compelling explanations about those moderators. So it's not like I was able to say, okay, well, this kind of violent media is okay and this kind isn't. And, exactly what the age trajectory of these effects is, again, it would take a lot of data, and data that would be hard to get to really map it out. So
yeah,
I can't give advice that goes much beyond common sense that, little kids are more influenceable and have weaker critical thinking skills than adults.
Right. Yeah. And their brains are, still developing and being shaped. And yeah, so it's funny. I remember one of the Addams Family films where the kids go to the camp, and Wednesday and Pugsley are like put in this little dollhouse in the middle of the of the woods, and they're like, you're so negative. We're going to make you watch Disney films for like 72 hours. And when they come out, they're all just like, I want to be in a play and I want to sing songs. And I'm like, we should do this to inmates. And like people, I was like, does this really work? Can this work? And I mean, obviously, I don't know if that works, but as adults, with like neuroplasticity and whatnot, like how, once our brains are somewhat developed, how much stretching or how much relearning or how, does the impact of film lessen because we're not developing, or, how much can we change?
Yeah. So neuroplasticity and development through the adult lifespan are things that I'm super interested in. And I'm actually working on another book now called Nimble Brain, which is about these issues.
Great.
And yeah, it's been like many things, impacted a bit by COVID times, but I'm still plugging away. Yeah. So we used to think that a lot of things in brain development were operating on a kind of a clock where things develop for a while and then they set, like the cement hardens, and then you got what you got. And there are some things where the underlying physiological mechanisms become less plastic through development. But what's more common is that it's kind of like in development, you think about like you're pushing a marble around a hilly landscape, and eventually the marble winds up in a ditch somewhere. And if the marble's sitting in the ditch, it's not going to be super easy to move it. But if you have enough of a disruption, you could kick it out of that ditch and it could wind up someplace very different. And that's how I think about a lot of phenomena in development. So if we get used to, viewing media in a certain way over our developmental experience. It's going to get harder and harder to change how we process that information. But if you do the right kinds of interventions, you can totally experience big changes in adulthood. And a great example of this in adult development is learning a new language, right? So we used to think there's a critical period for language acquisition, and once you're an adult, it's a lot harder to learn language, and you just basically can't pick up a new accent if you weren't exposed to that way of speaking as a child. And it's totally true that it's harder to pick up a new accent and become a native sounding speaker when you learn a language as an adult. But it's doable. And thinking about the brain from the point of view of, not being frozen, but maybe being stuck in a ditch somewhere, has led to the development of training programs that make it a lot more efficient for people to learn new accents.
Interesting. They're like, we know that you're here, and what it's going to take to get you out of there.
Yeah. So like if there's a contrast, like say you're a Japanese speaker and you're moving to America and you want to learn how to speak English with less of an accent. So your language, Japanese doesn't have a distinction between la and ra, right? And so the kind of stereotypic Japanese accent is one that switches up those two phonemes. So we can make training systems that exaggerate that acoustic contrast and train the brain to recognize it. And then you can start cranking it back down into the kind of range that you see in normal speech. And people can learn faster that way.
Yeah, interesting. You had also studied something about like mental imagery and how, to me, when I hear mental imagery, I think about like a sports psychologist and, how you're training your mind and like all of these things. So is that exactly what you were studying in that way, or in what way would that relate to film?
Yeah. So the term is older than sports psychology, and it refers to, forming images, visual or maybe auditory or touch or motor in your mind without the physical thing or action being there. Mm-hmm. And in sports psychology, the facility to do mental imagery is adopted to aid people's training programs, right? So one of the things that people do a lot is have people mentally practice motions or actions that they're doing as part of their sport. And that can totally work, in part because of this mirror system that we were talking about before. These representations of experiences and of actions that you might evoke because you're physically seeing something in front of you or because you're physically doing an action can be accessed by other routes. They can be accessed by just thinking about them. Or relevant for like movie perception, they can be accessed by reading about them or watching a movie. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we've been interested in is what aspects of your representation of a set of events that's happening are the same, whether you're experiencing those live or watching them on a screen or reading about them in a book. Movies are really interesting. Stories are really interesting too. And in particular, all these metaphors that people come up with about movies, having movies in their heads, I think are fascinating and are on target. So there's a kind of surprising amount of the brain's cortex that shows correspondences in its representations of events, whether those events are viewed or merely described in language.
Yeah. So just how like we're seeing something or visualizing it and how that can still have impact is like, I've read a lot about the sports psychology nature of it where, Phelps is thinking about, exactly like, trying to think his way through imagining winning, but seeing it on a screen, like you said, how you're in this like dark space and you're focused and how that impacts you. It's kind of like, you were giving the example of watching Pele kick, do a bicycle kick, and how just watching that visually, how you can actually feel like you're also doing the same thing is quite fascinating, how you're embodying the same thing as he is.
Yeah, I love to show that clip, because he's flying through the hair upside down, making this kick. And when people watch that, this is from the end of the John Huston movie Victory. And when people watch that, you just can't not feel your legs want to move.
Yeah. Yeah. Or like in Karate Kid, when they finally it's just like those moments you're like, yes, you just like feel it. It makes you physically want to get up out of your chair. Like I love those moments.
Absolutely. And one of the things I say in the book is like, go to an action movie with kids, because the kids will just get up out of their chair, and that's super fun.
Yeah. I remember going to see one of the latest Marvel films when we were still able to go into a theater. And the Marvel films is crazy how they just sell out completely, right? And at the time, I went to the theater alone, and the only ticket left was one of those like front aisle seats, wheelchair seats. So it's just me and like a complete stranger, like together. And I'll never forget, the beginning of the film, they're kind of talking about, all of these terrible things happened, and now the earth is in this terrible state, and it's supposed to be this really sad moment. And the man sitting next to me eating his little popcorn, he gasps, and he's like, oh, and I was like, I felt that, I felt you feel that just now. And this is like a Marvel film. And it's interesting thing about Marvel films, because I feel like Hollywood just keeps reeling these things out because they're easy there's not a whole lot of story. There's not, it's just all visual action happening on the screen. And, there's not much to translate. They can, send it around. You could watch this film and not understand a single word they're saying and still just be like, this is amazing. And, I'm always interested in why, how is that affecting us? Like, how do there has to be some type of psychology behind, seeing these characters like kids, whether you're a kid or you're this, 60-year-old man sitting next to me that's just so taken aback by this visual stimulation, and it's not even really about the story, it's just like Transformers and, explosions and all of this stuff. It's kind of wild how, it sells. It sells and it sells, and they keep remaking it till they'll come up with new superheroes. It's just like, that's the only thing playing now. It's like Christopher Nolan's latest film, which I'm always ready for a Nolan film. And then every Marvel, anything you can ever come up with. That's what we've got going so far. But I don't know. I mean, I like the next person. We love good story. And I don't know, as opposed to a drama or maybe like the 1990s ways of filmmaking and the types of films that were, in theaters then for mass consumption versus what we're seeing today, which now, of course, is shifting because everything's just Netflix and Apple TV and television shows, which I think is a positive move. But, do you see a difference between the types of films that we're kind of reeling out in the mass now and like the 90s in terms of like how it potentially be affecting, now it's just all like visual and action and Transformers as opposed to Forrest Gump and Mission Impossible, which I guess is action. But
I mean, I don't know that I have an accurate beat on like the historical development. We all know that that a dominant genre now is superhero films,
right?
And that people are doing all kinds of creative, wonderful things. I mean, you got the Marvel franchise, but within that you've got Into the Spider-Verse, and then you've got Watchmen. So you've got lots of parts of the space being explored. But beyond that, I don't know. You'd need a film scholar to really accurately describe the historical trend. But I do want to go back to one thing that you pick up on, one thing that you mentioned about this. You said there's not a lot of story, there's big visuals, and that's enough to deeply affect this person sitting next to you. And I'm really struck by those kinds of phenomena, because I think that a lot of us come into analyzing the emotional response to film with this implicit theory that the way you produce an emotional responses, you have plot with cause and effect and goals, and characters. And if you have a character that you identify with, and they have goals, and those goals are frustrated, that's going to make you feel bad by empathy. And I think that totally happens. But it's also totally the case that if you just like put up a 20-foot face crying and put some big music behind it, I'm going to be bawling. That's just,
at some point,
And we as viewers, I think, underestimate the power of this totally non-narrative, totally non-analytic pathway to experiencing affect.
Yeah. Have you seen The Social Dilemma on Netflix?
I have.
Okay. So.
And I've made all my family watch it too.
That also was kind of teed me off to be like, I need to talk to Jeff to see what does he think about this? Because they, in a very honest, seemingly honest way, they paint propaganda and, social media and just the visual medium in itself and how it's out to get us. And my personal takeaway from it was to think of, okay, we see how powerful this is and its potential. How can we use it for good? How it's not going anywhere, so how can we kind of use this technology and this knowledge and how it's shaping us and vice versa and the future, how can we kind of flip the script on it, because it can't all be bad. There's always the villain and the good guy, right? So They didn't talk too much about the good guy.
Well, one of the things I think that the film does really well is represent how a lot of the most negative consequences that manipulation economy aren't due to, an evil scheming, but to economic forces operating in the context of fast-moving technology and unintended consequences. And that totally resonates for me. I mean, I was in graduate school in the Bay Area in the 90s, and I lived a lot of the genesis of this technology. And there was a lot of utopianism in the tech community at that point. And I think that, people did not foresee a lot of these consequences. And I think even as folks were building these really manipulative technologies, people were thinking about it not in terms of manipulation, but in terms of like providing helpful information to people and collecting valuable information that could be monetized by selling it to advertisers and stuff. Mm-hmm. But as the film makes a really nice job, highlighting that you can analyze that as trading information, but really a more accurate and more incisive analysis to analyze it in terms of manipulating people's behavior, which is social psychology, right? Yeah. So, if the question is, how do these factors manipulate people's behavior? And we really need social psychologists now to help us understand that.
Right. Yeah. Because I think about yes, the long-term effects of it, just like the click or being, the scrolling or the mindless things that we do. Sometimes I open my phone and I'm like, what the hell am I doing on Instagram? I was trying to look at my email. I don't even know, I've been scrolling for 2 minutes now. Who am I? And it's just our brains are kind of on autopilot for some of this stuff. And I think that can be a little scary. I mean, I never went to film school. I went to business school, and I recall being, of course, at the time I didn't know that I wanted to be in film, but I was very interested in how we sell things even in a store, or what is it about our knowledge on psychology and selling something down to like the color that we make the product or where we place it on the shelf. But when it comes to propaganda or to commercials or filmmaking, how we shape the story or the narrative or what's playing on the screen because we want to manipulate the customer or the audience in some way. And I think there's like this, I feel like the curtain has been removed with The Social Dilemma and showing us that like there's also this added element that's happening, and it's not, yes, it's not just helpful, it is seemingly helpful, but it's also it is creating these neural pathways or like autopilot systems within us to scroll or click or buy or be like, oh yeah, I do want a new dog bowl, or yeah, I do like, this, and it's just like all of a sudden you're spending and you're this, it's this whole thing. And I have a lot of friends that will be like, oh, I had to get off social media because I just, it makes me feel bad about myself, it makes me feel depressed. And my response is, I understand, but my response is also, what are you subscribing to? Because anything that you follow, if you're following some bikini models and you're trying to get more in shape, that might make you feel bad, or you followed them, like I don't know, you can't help the ads that pop up. I guess you can click on them and say this isn't relevant, but I think that advertising is getting there is this psychological component that they're really privy to, that I think that the public hasn't really been thinking like, oh, they're using our brains and our psychology to want things that we wouldn't want, or to do things that we wouldn't normally do. And that's kind of where it gets a little sticky, I think. But it's kind of wild. Do you let your kids go on social media, or do you monitor that?
So I have two children, one 18, one 14, and I feel like we have been incredibly lucky. I don't take any credit for it, in that they just have been at a far end of the spectrum of not being super interested in gaming and not being super interested in social media. And just to be clear, I'm not like slagging either gaming or social media. I think gaming is like, one of the most interesting media and art forms going these days, right? But there's no doubt that for lots of children, developing the addictive qualities of some kinds of gaming can just be really profoundly problematic. And similarly, the addictive and socially damaging qualities of social media can be really problematic. So I don't have a lot of great advice there, just in part because I just kind of got dumb lucky. Like, we never had to worry about it too much. They always kind of made smart decisions without a lot of coaching from us. We were there to talk about this stuff. We have been there to talk about it, but I feel like I don't have brilliant advice as a result of having gotten lucky.
But the film just made it seem like we're going to hell in a handbasket, man. Well, it's like social media, like they're all out to get us. Like, are you in fear? Like, did it make you fearful, or were you like, I don't, maybe?
Having been engaged, I've been interested in the interactions between psychology and neuroscience and technology since before I went to graduate school. I worked in a telecom lab, doing cognitive science in a telecom lab before graduate school. So I've been engaged in this community for a long, long time. And that, I think, has given me some critical tools that have been helpful in navigating it. So I've always been reflective about my social media. And I understand, and I've, been lucky to just have more information than average about what information is collected from email systems, from social media systems, and how to control that. And so I've always been probably a little bit more conservative than the average person about turning off default sharing options, about using VPNs. But one concrete thing that I did like that evening was switched my default search engine to DuckDuckGo, because they don't collect, they don't collect tracking information.
Right.
And it's not that I don't value the services that companies like Google and Microsoft provide. It's just I don't really need to have those linked to my search history, query by query by query.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, aside from the data collecting of like private information, do you feel like this kind of technology is going to potentially shape the future of our brains and how they work? I mean, I feel like social media in general and the scrolling and all of this is already, our short fuse, our attention span is sort of out the window.
No doubt that any kind of repetitive activities that people do with variable reinforcement schedules impact the whole configuration of your psychology. Like the poster child for this is slot machines, right? Mm-hmm. People who sit for a long time in front of a slot machine don't come out like feeling great about life and feeling better in general most of the time. And, email or Facebook or Twitter is kind of like information seeking version of playing the slot machine. Each time you check it, there's a probability that you're going to get something that's going to make you feel better or is going to be of use to you, is going to be interesting. And there's a probability that you won't. And if it were always consistent, you wouldn't do it as much as you do, given that it's variable. And that's why those systems have,
that's why they work.
Have that variation. Right. Yeah. And it's not that, it doesn't take some evil person sitting down and saying, I'm going to design this to maximize addictive behavior. As the social dilemma suggests, there's some cases where that actually is what happens. But even without that, if you just imagine designers trying stuff at random and then looking at their ad sales to decide what to do, they're going to converge on these mechanisms that produce the maximal payoff for the companies. And that's not necessarily what's best for the users.
Right.
Can we talk though about one other thing in the social dilemma, which I thought was so cool? And I hope enough of the listeners will have heard it, will have watched it for this to resonate. But I thought it was so cool the way they took this abstract notion of algorithms deciding what to present in order to maximize economic payoff for the companies and turned it into these three dudes in a dark control room.
That's kind of great. Yeah.
Yeah. And because it's a very abstract concept, right? And I think that most of us don't have good intuitions about what it means for there to be a bunch of code between us and our Facebook friends. Mm-hmm. And just personalizing it in terms of this little team sitting in the control room, I just thought that was, I thought it was done so well, and so it captured, because one of the problems when you do an analogy like that is you might wind up reifying the wrong bits of it visually, or in terms of the characters. But I thought they actually kind of nailed the right aspects of what it means to have an algorithm in there and made it really compelling.
Yeah. No, I love that you brought that up, because I agree. That's definitely one of the more like memorable things is they really executed, the control room situation and how they're pinging off of each other. It helps you understand what's going, between the algorithms in your brain and like what to send you, and they know it's going to work. And it's just, and they know the knowledge of your habits, and it's like, oh, well, we've reached this far and last time they did this. So we know we put this in there, we've got them locked in. It's just, it was well done for sure.
And that's exactly how those machine learning algorithms work when they're trying to predictively adapt information feeds. Yeah. They're looking at, your previous behavior history and everybody else's, and using those to predict how you're going to respond.
Right. And so if we have all of this knowledge and we have this technology, my thought process is, well, if we know that we can produce this much change, if we can get somebody to buy something or make a decision, a big decision potentially in their life, with like steering them in such a way, why can't we do that for good? Why can't we do something positive? If we're able to create, they say that the suicide rate for teenagers because of social media is asinine. It's just crazy. And if it has that much power, if we can take people out with it, why can't we do something like just amazing? Like why can't we, heal so many different things? I don't know. Like I want to focus more on how we can use this technology and this knowledge to create change for the better, because we all, like, I feel like that it's such a huge component, especially in considering the times we are using social media to create change. We want to rally, we want to express how we feel, we want to advocate for each other. And why not use this technology to do so? But even kind of speaking to these companies, if there's just a lot of power there, if you can win an election with it, for the crying out loud, I'm just saying, it just.
So look, I think we should not forget that there are a lot of good scientists and technologists out there fighting the good fight and doing this. So, and people in advertising and people in marketing, the Ad Council has done for generations pro-social ad campaigns that did things like dramatically reducing the rate of smoking in this country, right? And there are, in the fields of social psychology and behavioral economics and health behavior and environmental psychology, are focused pretty intensively on facilitating sound decision making and pro-social behavior. And I think that the Social Dilemma does a really nice job of not villainizing these tech companies and social media companies, because it's often not a case of the good team versus the bad team. It's the good team versus the structural features of the situation that tend to lead to bad outcomes if we don't have a good team working really hard on it. In some ways, that's scarier to me, right? Because, coming back to the Marvel thing, it's not like we're just going to decapitate Thanos and everything's going to get better. It's the situation is what it is. But I think that, the scientists and the technologists do have a lot to offer on the plus end, and there's lots of them, including some of the people featured in that film who are working hard on it.
Yeah. So interesting. Well, is there anything that you're working on that you kind of want to chat about, or let us know? I know you said you have a new book that you're chipping away at during this coronavirus time.
Yeah, so that's going to be called Nimble Brain, and it'll come out as soon as I can make it come out. But right now, a lot of my time has been focused on the lab and my teaching and my university, and on work for scientific societies I'm involved with who are coping with coronavirus and with these deeply concerning questions of social justice and systemic racism in science and society.
Yeah.
So those things, just a few little things here and there, and they might slow down the book. Yeah.
No, that's really great. All of those topics are really important. And, there's one last thing I just wanted to kind of touch on and ask you about. Perhaps it's not your particular field, but some of my nerding out on the brain had to do with the biology of the male versus the female brain. And there's, when it comes to filmmaking, there's I don't know, they say a woman's going to definitely want to watch the romantic comedy. And therefore, even as a female director, I would say I would get offered more opportunity to do quote unquote female driven content or whatnot. Hollywood loves to put people in boxes. It's easy to package. But as a woman who's also a filmmaker, I still want to do an explosion and drive a car through it. I don't know. I want to be the first woman to direct the next Bond film. I still want to do the exciting stuff. The people I admire are doing more action and sci-fi and drama and, these things. But when it comes to the biological differences between the male and female brain in terms of film making and watching a film, is there, from my personal studies, I was really surprised to see that some of the things that people get upset about, whether you're feminine or just what defines us as, a male or a female, what our likes are or dislikes are, a lot of it is actually based in our biology and not necessarily our, sociology or socialization as humans. And so I'm just I know it's kind of loaded, but what would you think about the male versus female brain in terms of filmmaking and the impact? Or is that something that you can speak on at all?
It is not my area of expertise, but I'm somewhat familiar. And, speaking broadly as a cognitive neuroscientist, I would first come back to the thing that we were talking about probabilistic causes before, and say, whenever somebody says, well, because one is a man or a woman or undecided, that therefore you're going to behave in a certain way, you should get suspicious, because any group differences in neuroanatomy or neurophysiology are going to be matters of distributions and probabilities. And second, I'd say that there are group differences in neuroanatomy and neurophysiology between men and women, and there are associations between those group differences and behavior, but sometimes they're relatively strong. More often, they're quite weak, and very often differences that people have assumed to be primarily driven by genetic sex differences turn out to be driven as much or totally or lots more by culture and developmental experience. So, whenever somebody says that there's a biological sex difference in the brain, that means that there's some limitation on what somebody can do. I think, you got to start by saying, show me the evidence that it's due to that and not these other things that are very plausible alternative causes.
Sure. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, one thing that I learned about like women with our spatial awareness turns on and off. So like, for example, the last time I tried to buy a couch, 4 couches later, realizing all 4 did not fit in my apartment. I now, it's like things like this, not that I wouldn't be able to do something better, but, the way that our brains work in terms of like understanding language or how we process things slightly differently. Not that one is better than the other. It's just there is some type of biological difference there that maybe makes us more attuned to certain things.
That may pan out, but even if it pans out, you got to caveat it with like in general, on average, right? Yeah. So I can find plenty of guys in my life who cannot figure out whether the couch is going to fit in the room or not, right? It's just.
Well, thank you for covering that last little bit.
Sure.
I'm like, you might know the answer to this last little question that I happen to have. But no, it's been such a delight to have you. And I really appreciate you coming on and giving us some knowledge. I'm super looking forward to your new book. So please do let us know. We'd love to have you back when it's back. Or,
cool.
Yeah.
No, that'd be super fun.
And Flickr, I tell everyone I know, it's going to be like a Christmas gift to everybody. I'm such a fan.
Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking all this time to think about the brain and perception and behavior with me. These are the things that keep me up at night.
Yes, me too. Well, thank you again, and we really look forward to having you next time. And have an amazing week. We'll chat soon.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Zach.
Music for the podcast is by Rarebit, aka Justin Dosher Hopkins. Creative producer is Noah Wainwright. Research is by Trevor Joyce. Editing and YouTube support is by Tyler Scully. Thanks so much for tuning in, and see you next time.